In 1777, the war is entering its second bloody year. Both sides have been learning important lessons from the war, first ignited at Lexington and Concord. Battles like Bunker Hill have proved that the Americans can stand up against professional British troops, while the failed invasion of Canada showed both loyalist resolve and how unforgiving the countryside could be for marching armies. By spring, the British are finally ready to start significant and ambitious offensive campaigns, while other European powers look on with increasing interest. Colonial battlefield defeats in 1776 had persuaded Washington of two things. Firstly, that he would not be able to replicate Bunker Hill with a war of posts, as the British would now simply outflank his positions. And secondly, that he must now pursue a Fabian strategy in New York, avoiding large-scale battles in favour of smaller, indirect skirmishes to wear down the British. Although Congress is divided on how to progress the war, Washington is able to run military affairs as he sees fit. His army must contend with severe supply, financial, and enlistment issues, but with their control of much of the country, key orders can also be communicated in hours or days, and supplies and reinforcements can move quickly and without harassment. Washington's goal for the year is simple: maintain independence while making the war both as costly and futile for the British as he can. Although the British maintain military and financial supremacy, their situation in 1777 is nonetheless daunting. They control only one significant port in the 13 colonies, New York, and must fight simultaneously both a guerrilla and conventional war thousands of miles from home. For General Howe, the commander of British land forces in North America, following the defeats at Trenton and Princeton, he now believes that he does not have the manpower to pacify and garrison large swathes of territory. But he also believes that he will not have to in order to force Congress to sue for peace. General Howe sees the center of gravity for the revolution to revolve critically around both Washington and Congress, and he therefore plans in 1777 to destroy both of them by moving against the capital, Philadelphia. By doing so, he believes that Washington will be forced to defend the city, giving Howe the opportunity to defeat the Continentals in a decisive final battle, and then capture the seat of the rebel government to cement his victory. But the British command is not unified under its commander-in-chief, General Howe. 3,000 miles away, Lord George Germain, the Secretary of State for the Colonies and the minister responsible for the British war effort, is considering a second plan put forward by General John Burgoyne. Burgoyne is an aggressive commander, well liked by his troops, but he is also arrogant and desperate to take an independent command in North America. His proposal is not new, and he plans for 3 columns to converge on Albany, with Burgoyne leading an army from Canada southwards. The theory is that by controlling the Hudson River, they can isolate and besiege the more rebellious New England colonies. But no one specifies a plan for subsequent operations into New England, and because of the logistic and communication challenges between the armies, the plan is ambitious. Crucially for many officers in the field, it remains unclear how exactly control of the Hudson River will deliver the knockout blow to the colonists envisioned by politicians in London. For both Howe and Burgoyne's competing plans, it is Lord Germain's job to reconcile the two. But he is indecisive and far from both the battlefield and his commander-in-chief in New York. Exchanging letters takes months, which makes close coordination and flexible decision-making impossible. Germain approves both plans, believing that Howe will be able to move north and support Burgoyne after capturing Philadelphia. But this is wildly optimistic. By the time Burgoyne reaches Quebec in May to lead an army south from Canada, he receives a letter from General Howe with the reality of the situation. Howe informs him that he is unlikely to be able to support the push to Albany, removing a critical piece of the strategy before the campaign has even begun. Despite these problems, Burgoyne still commands a significant force in Canada, He has approximately 10,000 men at his disposal, and he plans to take 8,000 south while sending 1,800 men down the Mohawk River as a diversionary force. The northern department of the Continental Army consists of 7,000 men under the command of General Schuyler. Since the beginning of the year, Schuyler has been nervously asking for assistance. His forces are, like in Washington's army, low on both supplies and morale. Burgoyne begins moving south in June and marches towards the formidable Fort Ticonderoga, which, due to its strategic location, is a crucial gateway and line of defense into New England. The fort is considered almost impregnable, and the British anticipate that taking it will be one of the major battles of the campaign. But General Schuyler and the fort's commander, General St. Clair, had been pessimistic about their chances of holding it. Inexplicably, provisions have not been gathered, militias have not been called out, and key hills overlooking Ticonderoga have been left unfortified. Screening the main British Army's arrival on the 2nd of July, Burgoyne's Indian allies start to harass any Continentals that leave the safety of the fort. The Indians provide invaluable scouting and raiding services for the British, acting like cavalry in the dense wilderness. Their presence also strikes fear in the 3,000-strong Continental garrison, and defeatism spreads through the ranks and leadership. When the British take hold of hills overlooking the fort, St. Clair orders a withdrawal south. The abandonment of the fort sends shockwaves through both camps, with Washington and Congress incensed by the loss of such a crucial position without a fight. Washington quickly dispatches the energetic Benedict Arnold to support Schuyler's troubled command. For Burgoyne, both his confidence in the army and disdain for the Continentals soars. The British begin their pursuit and catch up twice to the Continental rearguard, defeating them in minor engagements as they push south, reaching the abandoned Fort Edward on the 29th of July. Although the campaign is going well for Burgoyne, he repeatedly pauses the advance south, to the confusion of some of his officers, and waits for critical supplies from Canada, including horses, wagons, and fodder. His supply and logistical problems are mounting and are being compounded by Continental troops who continuously cut down trees that block the narrow roads and trails south. When war broke out in 1775, tribes in the Northern Theatre were quickly embroiled into the fighting. For these tribes, their relationship with their European neighbours was often fraught with tension and conflict. Foreign disease alone had more than halved the size of many of the tribes, after coming into contact with smallpox and other illnesses. By the 18th century, even the most powerful Indian group in the north, the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, counted only around 10,000 people compared to 2.4 million colonists. The organization of the tribes varied, with some, like the Iroquois, subdividing their tribes into clans. For the Iroquois, these were then led by clan mothers, who would select clan representatives to serve as diplomats or war chiefs. The small size of the tribes limited their ability to raise large armies for war, with the Mohawks, for example, only being able to field warriors in the hundreds. The size of the forces also affected their strategy. Offensive operations utilized raiding parties to strike hard and fast against an opponent. Psychological warfare was widely employed to destabilize and break an enemy's morale. Attacks at dawn and scalpings were common practice. Indian warriors that were captured in battle, particularly by the Iroquois, could face brutal torture. Total war was also used, with raiding parties destroying all in their path. If anyone was spared, they could be incorporated into the victor's clan to replenish numbers, a practice that brought a number of European settlers into tribal life. Colonial propaganda often exaggerated the violence, giving Indians a reputation for savagery and mutilation, which helped to create a common enemy and justified the seizure of land. In reality, the Indians were no more brutal than their British and colonial counterparts, who regularly destroyed entire Indian villages and their inhabitants. On the battlefield, Indian tactics favoured ambushing and hitting an enemy from multiple directions or at the flanks. These tactics incorporated, as needed, elements of advance, retreat, and firepower. Warriors fought as individuals, working independently but towards common goals. Fighting against European foes in wooded terrain, an Indian warrior would often wait for the flash of a musket before charging and closing for the kill, using clubs, knives, and tomahawks. They sought to gain personal recognition through acts of bravery or by killing individual enemies. This made the act of fighting and war more personal, reflecting cultural values of honor and courage. During a battle, war parties would retreat at the threat of large casualties, and for individuals, there was no shame in running away to fight another day, only in surrendering to an enemy force. From the outset of the American Revolution, many tribes sought to side with the British, who promised to honor Indian land claims and limit further colonial westward expansion. While many others remained neutral, some sided with the Continentals because of existing strong relations, or in the belief that they would secure favorable terms after the war. Within the Iroquois Confederacy, the Mohawks, Seneca, Onondagas, and Cayugas became important British allies, as the Oneidas and Tuscaroras became for the Continentals. The divided Confederacy, for the most part, avoided combat against one another and provided their European allies with critical scouting, raiding, and intelligence gathering services. Whatever the outcome of the war, the loss of land, cultural identity, and independence would inevitably continue for the besieged tribes of North America. Further west, British General St. Leger has been moving with his 1,800-strong diversionary force along the Mohawk River. He arrives at Fort Stanwix on the 2nd of August, and unlike at Ticonderoga, this time the Continental garrison makes a stand. As the siege commences, an 800-strong Patriot and Indian force is organised to relieve the garrison and marches west to Fort Stanwix. But St. Leger is informed of their movements and sends a combined party of 500 loyalists and Indians to intercept. For the militias now converging on each other, many of the men on both sides were relatives or knew each other as neighbours. Likewise for the Indians, the tribes on both sides were from the Iroquois nation. The Seneca chiefs, fighting with the Loyalists, select a ravine to ambush the approaching Patriot force at Oriskany, placing Loyalist militias across a stream and Indian warriors on the flanks. The approaching Patriot commander, General Nicholas Herkimer, has been hesitant to advance, but his brother is a known Loyalist fighting with St. Leger, and Herkimer is soon accused by his men of also being a Loyalist, which convinces him to push forward. As the colonists enter the ravine, the slaughter begins. The Patriots fight bravely, but attacked from all sides. Within 30 minutes, half of the 800 men have been killed or flee. As the fighting continues, a sortie from the fort attacks the now empty Loyalist camp, forcing the ambush to eventually be called off. But the damage has been done, and 385 Patriot militiamen lay dead, with another 80 wounded and captured. For the Continentals, despite the disaster, the garrison at Fort Stanwix does not submit to calls to surrender. Soon afterwards, Benedict Arnold brings a further relief column west, and on his approach, he's able to spread rumours in St. Leger's camp that the approaching Continental force is larger than it really is. The British fall for the ruse and end the siege, falling back to Canada and abandoning their advance on Albany. General Burgoyne soon finds out about St. Leger's withdrawal. A letter from General Howe also finally confirms that he will not be able to assist the campaign, critical information that Burgoyne keeps secret from his senior officers. To add to the isolation, the majority of the Indians begin to leave the army, following both tensions over alleged atrocities and Burgoyne's misunderstanding and mishandling of the relationship. In an attempt to improve his continuous supply issues, Burgoyne sends a detachment of 1,400 German troops to Bennington to capture cattle and fodder, but they are met by 2,500 Continentals under General John Stark, who kill 200 and capture a further 700 Germans. As August turns into September, both armies now have approximately 6,500 men. At this critical juncture, Burgoyne has a decision to make. He can fall back to Ticonderoga for the winter or push on to Albany. Despite having every reason to turn back, Burgoyne insists that his orders from London are clear and he continues the advance. At the same time, Congress replaces the dispirited General Schuyler with General Horatio Gates, a cold and arrogant former British Army officer who brings the Continentals closer to Burgoyne and digs in south of Saratoga on heights blocking the road to Albany. With news of the success at Bennington and rumours of an Indian invasion following the Battle of Oriskany, thousands of militia reinforcements are also starting to swell the Continental ranks. The two forces are now on a collision course at Saratoga. On September 13th, Burgoyne crosses to the west side of the Hudson River with 1 month's supply of food. This cuts his line of retreat and communication north, but it does mean he can now concentrate his army without having to garrison a chain of potentially vulnerable outposts. Without their Indian allies, the British lack intelligence to the exact size and disposition of the Continentals, but Burgoyne does know that the Americans are dug in along the Bemis heights. He plans to fix Gates in position and then outflank him from the west to force an American withdrawal or crush them against the river. General Gates orders Benedict Arnold, now his second in command, to take the left flank of the Continental Army. But both men's prickly temperaments have been causing tensions. Arnold argues for probing attacks against the British, while Gates wants a more passive defence. On the 19th, Burgoyne's army advances in 3 columns, with remaining Indians and Loyalists acting as scouts. The columns advance at the same time and are planned to be mutually supportive. Arnold recognises the threat posed by the high ground to the west, virtually unoccupied by the Continentals, which could be used to bombard and outflank their defences on the heights. After several hours, Gates finally relents to Arnold's requests to move forward and meet the advancing British. Colonel Morgan's riflemen lead the way, followed by close to 3,000 men under Arnold's command. The two armies meet at Freeman's farm, which encompasses large fields and clearings surrounded by woods. Continental riflemen get the better of the opening encounter, but arriving elements of Fraser's column push Morgan's men back in turn. The front line develops across the open ground, and both armies begin trading deadly volleys. The British attempt to turn to the bayonet and surge across the field into enemy lines, but accurate fire leads to horrific casualties and the attacks stall. Continental counterattacks are met in the same way as the battle descends into a desperate slugging match. Generals on both sides, including Burgoyne and Arnold, are in the thick of the fighting and personally lead charges into enemy lines, keeping morale high on both sides. By 3 p.m, the British centre is being hard-pressed by New Hampshire and Connecticut troops, but well-coordinated counterattacks with bayonets and artillery check American progress. British cannon on the left are repeatedly captured and then recaptured in desperate melees. Across the front, the fighting is brutal and often at close quarters, as units stumble into one another and charge again and again into each other's positions along the woodline. Arnold becomes concerned about a breakthrough as the British push forward on his right, but Gates refuses to commit more regiments, forcing Arnold in desperation to collect any man available in camp, including men on guard duty, and hurl them at the British to once again stabilise the line. Thick musket smoke covers the battlefield, and the sounds of wounded and dying men are only covered by the constant cannon and volley fire. At 5 p.m, The British left column under General Riedesel, comprising mostly of German units, has finally received orders to aid in the centre and arrives just as the sun begins to set on Freeman's farm. They advance onto the field just in time to see the British centre barely fight off another American assault. With the battle hanging in the balance, the Germans immediately attack the exposed continental flanks. Supported by exhausted British troops who advance with renewed confidence, they finally force the Americans from the field. In the fading light, no pursuit is possible, and both sides begin to lick their wounds. The Continentals had lost the field, and almost 500 dead, wounded, and captured. The British losses were higher, with official figures at almost 600. Burgoyne had won a Pyrrhic victory, but his strategic situation had worsened. He was no closer to Albany, 30 miles away, and he now had hundreds of wounded to care for. Burgoyne's personal bravery was unquestionable during the fighting, but his insistence to be with his men meant that he was unable to step back and assess the battlefield. Had he better coordinated the three columns, he could have brought concentrated power to bear and won a convincing victory. The same is true for Arnold, who was adamant after the battle that had Gates listened to his pleas for reinforcements, the Continentals would have destroyed the advancing British columns one by one. It seemed that both sides' inability to concentrate their forces had led to bloody stalemate at Freeman's farm. In the following days, Burgoyne starts to dig in and build fortifications of his own. On the 21st of September, he receives vital news. General Clinton in New York had been reading reports from the north with growing concern and now offers Burgoyne a lifeline. To divert Continental troops south, on October 3rd, Clinton and 3,000 men move up the Hudson River. A string of forts are quickly captured and Clinton's force soon comes within 70 miles of Saratoga. Burgoyne sits tight and makes no further attacks while he waits for news of Clinton's arrival. But just as a second expedition is preparing to move on Albany, General Howe orders Clinton to instead send his army to Philadelphia. Clinton is furious at the decision, but he can do nothing, and Burgoyne will have to fight his way out of Saratoga alone. In the Continental camp, General Gates and Arnold's relationship has now collapsed. Despite Arnold leading the army at Freeman's farm, Gates fails to mention him in dispatches and then removes many of the troops under his command. The insults are too much for the fiery Arnold, and he considers leaving the army. After a petition is signed by almost the entire army's colonels and generals requesting that he stays, Arnold relents. But aside from the senior rivalries, the Continental Army is in good condition, and fresh militia arrive in the camp each day, bringing the total to over 12,000 men. Across the field, Burgoyne's position is quickly becoming desperate. Heavy rain and cold temperatures are damaging morale and leading to daily desertions. And without his Indian allies, he has little to no intelligence of his enemy, who now controls the no man's land and the surrounding territory. To reach Albany, he must defeat or outmaneuver Gates's army before his supplies run out, giving him weeks. But even in Albany, he would still face a bitter winter deep in enemy territory. A retreat to Ticonderoga remains possible, but his slow-moving army would be vulnerable to attack along the way. By early October, Burgoyne must make a decision. He orders a reconnaissance in force for October 7th as one last attempt to test the American flank for weaknesses and forage for much-needed food. If a weakness is found, the entire army will attack the following day. If not, the army will finally retreat north and to the safety of Canada. At 10 a.m. on the 7th, Burgoyne leads his 1,700-strong reconnaissance force towards the American lines. When news reaches Gates of the British movements, he dispatches Arnold to investigate, their relationship finally being restored in the previous days. Morgan's riflemen are ordered against the British right, and New Hampshire regiments are sent against the left. As the Americans begin to form up, British cannon open fire, but to little effect in the thick woods. The Second Battle of Saratoga has begun. On the British left, the Continentals attack quickly and violently. Artillery batteries change hands several times as British grenadiers struggle to hold on against New Hampshire Continentals in furious fighting. By 3 p.m, the British are forced to give way, and an organised retreat quickly turns into a rout on the flank. German regiments in the rear get caught up in the collapse, abandoning artillery crews under Captain Pausch, who heroically under fire redeploys his guns to the rear. The Continentals soon set about rolling up the British line, just as the attack on the right begins. Morgan's riflemen have swung around behind the British and now attack them from multiple directions. The effect is devastating, and the entire British line soon begins to disintegrate. Burgoyne can do nothing to slow the attack, and with his horse hit and bullet holes in his clothing, he orders a retreat back to the defences. General Gates, lightly happy with how the battle is going, sends Arnold a steady stream of reinforcements being requested to maintain momentum and carry on the assault. At 4 p.m, troops from Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut arrive alongside Arnold. They now significantly outnumber the British, whose cohesion has completely crumbled. British General Fraser makes a brave stand with his 24th Regiment, acting as a rearguard and preventing a number of neighbouring units from being overrun. But they take heavy casualties, including the popular and talented General Fraser, who is shot dead from his horse. British troops scramble into their redouts, but the Continentals and militias are fast on their heels, and outer works are quickly captured. Arnold leads further attacks, but these are beaten back with heavy casualties. Attention is then switched to a second redoubt further north, now manned by just 200 British troops. Arnold moves forward once again, recklessly riding between positions, and attacks with 2,000 men from multiple directions. Arnold is the first to storm the parapets, but he is hit in the leg during the fighting. Perhaps wanting to die a hero, he tells surrounding comrades that he wished the bullet had gone through his heart instead. Despite the wounds, Arnold continues to direct the battle while encouraging his men on. As the Americans climb into the fortifications, the British commander is killed, and the rest of the men soon flee into the woods to save themselves. As the sun begins to set, the fighting dies down with it. The battle is over, and Burgoyne's reconnaissance has been a complete disaster. All of the newly foraged food is captured, along with large numbers of cannon and other critical supplies. The British have also suffered almost 900 losses, including a large number of senior officers. The Second Battle of Saratoga has been an unquestionable American victory, thanks in no small part to both Gates and Arnold's leadership. Burgoyne's options were now almost non-existent. In the coming days, a number of councils of war would eventually agree that capitulation is their only choice. General Gates, receiving reports that Clinton's army had been successfully moving towards Albany, is keen to end the fighting in Saratoga quickly. He agrees to surprisingly lenient terms that include allowing the British to return to Europe, provided that they do not fight again in North America. The entire British army surrenders on the 17th with full honours. Those terms would never be implemented, however, and Congress would soon revoke the agreement. In captivity, many of the surrendered British and German troops would eventually die of disease or escape to new lives in America. The Saratoga Campaign would have far-reaching consequences. Burgoyne would be paroled to England the following year, where he would spend the rest of his life defending his actions, while never commanding an army again. Burgoyne would be widely blamed for the defeat, particularly for his insistence to move towards Albany, despite the many obvious signs to change course. But Lord Germain was also to blame. The failure highlighted the challenges of attempting to coordinate a war from different continents, and Lord Germain's inability to create a singular and undivided strategy for the war in 1777. The defeat, instead of ushering in the end of the conflict, as many hoped, started the emergence of a new strategy in London, one that would shift the war from the north to a new major theatre of operations in the southern colonies. There were other European consequences for the campaign as well. France had been eagerly watching events in North America since the outbreak of the conflict. French foreign ministers were not interested in recapturing old French territories, but rather in dealing a damaging blow to a chief rival and revenge for the defeats they suffered during the 7 Years' War. For the British, what they feared most from the disaster at Saratoga was not further American gains, but instead that the victory would convince France to enter the war, turning a localized rebellion into a worldwide conflict. The French had already been, in secret, supplying huge quantities of aid to the Continentals. At Saratoga alone, it is estimated that up to 90% of American arms were French supplied. Before Saratoga, further negotiations between the two had stalled, but within days of news arriving in Paris of the surrender, a Franco-American alliance was soon being drafted between Benjamin Franklin and the French foreign minister, the Count of Burgoyne. The alliance is finally signed in February 1778, with part of the agreement only coming into effect if Britain and France went to war, which now only seemed a matter of time. Although Saratoga had been a crushing and complete American victory, it had not been the only campaign in 1777. Further south, General Howe had begun a major campaign against both Washington and Philadelphia, where he is looking to deliver a knockout blow. Thank you for watching our series on the American Revolution, and of course, a huge thanks as well to our Patreon and YouTube supporters. Join now to get early access and vote on future videos. Thanks again, and until next time.